I am here today with Eldon Thompson, who has written the novels of the Legends of Asahiel. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah. I say Azaheel, but I've heard
Asahiel.
it many, many different ways. So.
Hey, well, if you're the one who wrote it, you should be the one to figure out how to pronounce it. So,
Well, even I had to be corrected along the line. It was different in my head, and then one of my brothers started pronouncing it a different way, and they corrected me. So.
well, I mean, to be fair, in linguistics, technically, however you pronounce something is correct as long as you're understandable to whomever you're speaking with.
There you go.
Yeah, that's the whole thing.
Get out of jail free card.
Something like that, yeah. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're working on in the midst of all of this craziness.
Yeah, amidst the craziness, I've actually got, I thought I would have a little more time than I normally do, but it hasn't turned out that way yet. So I started writing really as, I don't remember a time where I wasn't telling stories. I grew up with four brothers, and I remember at age of 4 asking my dad to teach me how to read so I could start writing stories down. So I've always been a writer, storyteller at heart. Even in my early grade years, when we were given creative writing assignments to write a 1 or 2 page story, I was writing 30-page, fully illustrated, episodic,
Yep.
Horror and fantasy and whatnot. My biggest influences were probably Terry Brooks growing up, Lloyd Alexander's Prydian Chronicles, Terry's Shannara series. Gone into some of the early Forgotten Realms, Dungeons and Dragons type writings by Salvatore and Greenwood and those folks. So my first trilogy, which was published mid 2000s by HarperCollins, that was a really traditional grand scale epic fantasy cast of thousands, where I was trying to take the typical farm boy, orphan farm boy story and like a lot of folks then try to subvert a lot of those tropes and cliches that we all find, and the ones that felt kind of silly to me growing up, a little too heroic, a little less realistic.
Yep.
I took in a somewhat grittier direction. Nowadays, I would say it's maybe kind of early grimdark, but not. I don't think it's certainly as grim as or hopeless as the some of the stuff that's come out since then, the George Martins and those guys.
Yeah.
But then what happened is at the end of that trilogy, I had planned to do a continuation, and my executive editor at HarperCollins and all my readers really wanted to know what happened to a particular character who was a supporting character.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so I'm sure that's happened to a lot of folks out there, a lot of writers out there. Bob Salvatore, Ari Salvatore was maybe a famous example with his drow character, Drizzt Do'Urden, or Dritz as he pronounces it. He was supposed to be a side character, a sidekick to his Wolfgar Barbarian, but everybody liked the Dritz character, so that's where he ended up writing 25 plus books. So the same thing happened to me with a character called Kylak Cronus, a younger guy, kind of maybe a Billy the Kid in a fantasy setting, basically peerless with blades, and raised as an assassin, but didn't really have any interest in that sort of work. Has a little bit more of a moral compass than that. So off came this spin-off series, essentially, which we called the Warder series. And it's essentially Kylak's looking to get out of where he's been, looking for more kind of a thirst for adventure. Just had this big epic battle, didn't think there could possibly anything as exciting as that happen. So he's looking to go overseas and try something else, and gets caught up in a web of deceit and doesn't necessarily realize it. He's kind of a action, take action before you think too hard kind of guy.
Yep.
The story I wanted to play with is because we've established this guy is, again, a peerless fighter. So he's pretty arrogant about that because no one's been able to prove otherwise. But there's obviously ills out there in the world that don't care how good you are with a sword. And this, coronavirus pandemic we're dealing with is maybe a perfect example of that. Like, it doesn't matter how good you are. You get sick, you deal with certain challenges, and, you're still mortal too. So
hard lesson to learn, that one. Have you finished that next follow-on series?
I actually have. So what happened is I started it way back when, and then got distracted by mostly Hollywood writing. I've done a lot of. I actually sold a feature-length screenplay of Terry Brooks's Elfstones of Shannara to Warner Brothers back in like 2007, and that ended up not going to be greenlit. The studio head, Alan Horn, they were going to fast track it at Warner's, and then he got lured away by Disney, and the director, Mike Newell, ended up doing Prince of Persia, which didn't fare very well, and so the whole thing didn't happen. But I got lots of script assignments in the meantime, so I've done a lot of adaptations and some original work for Hollywood. But I always really wanted to come back to the Kylax story. And in 2013, Sean Speakman, who he runs a small press, Grim Oak Press, a specialty press, and he did an anthology of short stories from mostly fantasy fiction writers. There was a Wheel of Time excerpt in there from Brandon Sanderson, and Patrick Rothfuss added something, Terry Brooks, Tad Williams, all kinds of folks. So he had invited me to add a short story to that. Ended up being a Kylax Cronus origin story of sorts. It was well received overall, and so that kind of scratched the itch, and I got back to the Kylax story. I wrote all 3 books, and they were all actually published end of 2018. I could get into a long story about how that came about, but yeah, right at the end of 2018, all 3 were released, so they're available. They've been available for a little over a year now. Yeah.
Very exciting. What's next?
What next is I have 3 options now in front of me. As you well know, anytime you finish a series, no matter how bored of it or sick of it you are from overload, which I tend to get. There's always reader demand for, when's the next one coming out?
Yep.
So now with 2 trilogies out, there's readers demanding sequels to the Azaheel books still. There's readers asking for sequels to the Kylax series, and also on the short story end, there's people wanting to know more snippets, because as much as I've written about Kylax now, there's not a whole lot about his background. There's a lot that's teased, and so a lot of folks want to know more of the story. So I have an idea of doing multiple short stories to kind of fill in some of his prehistory, if you will, for those who are interested in some of the key moments in his adventure. So those 3 roads are in front of me. I think the short story may be the most likely output right now. I find those a little easier to write at the moment because I still do some writing for Hollywood, and they tend to be pretty demanding when they want something.
It's going to change now that things are rather shut down a bit.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean.
Hollywood's kind of on freeze right now, certainly. Yeah. So if that's gonna, nobody knows how long this is gonna last. So if this ends up being a few weeks, I'm sure it'll be a bump in the road for them. If it ends up going months and months, who knows? So right now, anyway, I'm thinking I might fill in some of those short stories, and if I end up with more time on my hand, then I'll have to, make a decision on whether or not I'm doing more the next Kylax adventure, or whether I'm going back to the Azaheel books, which eventually I plan to tie them all back together. So I never intended to take this side route, but it's been fun. It's I don't know. I know you've written. I've read you've written 22 different books and probably counting. So for me, it was fun. It was a fun diversion, and each just the viewpoint character. So even though there were a lot of viewpoint characters in the original books, the primary character tends to think a lot more, be very introspective, and that's been a criticism from some readers, is like, he thinks so much, and it was a plot point and everything that ended up being critical of the story. But just like a lot of those readers, for me, it's fun to write someone who doesn't think about every move he makes or could make before he makes it, and just and much more streamlined in the thinking, and much less concerned with the world around him. And so that, for me, that's a breath of fresh air to be able to bounce back and forth between different viewpoints. And so the Kylax one was definitely not one I intended, but ended up being a fun diversion.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, that's usually how the writing world goes, is, I was doing a thing and it ended up somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah, and are you the famous question, are you an architect or a gardener? Do you plan your stuff ahead, or do you tend to discover it as you go?
That depends on what it is that I'm writing. I've had some stories where the story just kind of appears magically on the paper and I'm not entirely sure how. And then I have some where I have to actively battle with my characters to say, you will go here and you will go here and you will go here. So it depends.
So the
I'm
story kind of takes control for you more often than not, would you say?
more often than not. To say the more complex it is, the less likely I am to plan it out. So
Really? Okay. So yeah, I tend to be more of a grinder, an architect. I want to have a vision of
sure.
everything before I put it down, and that, of course, never works, no matter how carefully it's plotted out.
Oh,
I still find still find gaps along the way, and yeah, you follow something that a character takes on a life of its own, and you're like, yeah, this is more interesting.
hmm
So I got to go back to the outline and change that blueprint all around, see if I can't predict where it's going. Um,
It's probably how you ended up with a different trilogy than you intended.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, you just never know how, and then yeah, the reader response. You never know what people are necessarily going to latch onto. You hope they're excited about the things you are, but sometimes they're excited about things. In fact, I still remember my agent's favorite scene in my first book. Before he became my agent, he really loved this scene that he told me was the one that really, drug him into the story, and that would have been the first scene I would have cut had I been forced to edit, and told, hey, you got to trim a scene or a certain number
Mhm.
of pages. I would have gone straight to that because it was actually a dream sequence, and
Ah,
those are famously misused or
uh-huh.
overused a lot of the time,
Just a touch.
right? So I'm like, yeah, that one felt like it could be a cheat. So, and he was like, oh no, that was the one that really had me hooked, and when I really cared about your characters, and so I'm like, well, there you go. I guess that one's staying.
Okay, then. It's probably a good thing to know sooner rather than later.
Yes, for sure.
hmm So, as far as screenwriting goes, I haven't done it all that much, but I do know that it is entirely different than writing a novel.
It is and it isn't. So, I mean, my story was that I was writing books, and I got to a point where I felt like this was maybe late 90s, and I
hmm
thought, well, the 1,000-page fantasy novel's been done to death. Nobody really needs to read more of that for me. But epic fantasy movie, even though I really enjoyed some of the earlier campy movies, I love the Conan the Barbarian. Um, there were ones like Beastmaster,
uh-huh.
Willow in the 80s. And, so Jurassic Park had come out. And this was just pre Lord of the Rings. But,
hmm
Braveheart was my favorite film of all time at that point. Jurassic Park showed what could be done with special effects. So I'm thinking, hey, now it's time to do epic fantasy on the screen.
Oh,
And
yeah.
then Lord of the Rings came out, and nobody in Hollywood wanted to do another Lord of the Rings because they didn't want to be compared to that because it was so good,
Right.
so well done. But at that time, when I was thinking, hey, maybe I'll go the movie route, I actually moved to California grew up in Oregon, lived in Idaho for a brief time, moved down to California to learn the screenwriting. And format, yes, it's completely different. And it's very strict in terms of page counts and where certain important events, tentpole moments have to occur.
Right.
But as far as the storytelling, it really helped me at least to really study the fact that the old Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces, which of course spawned all kinds of screenwriting books that are all based on the hero's journey,
hmm
and how it does follow this very specific template. And that helped me in regard to knowing that, oh, I don't have to, most of us, we look at a blank page and find it frightening.
hmm
It's just getting that momentum, overcoming the inertia is the hardest part. So starting with this skeleton, this framework that is, really to be found through most literature, it was for me comforting, because then as I filled in some of these tentpole moments, I could then it basically broke the story down for me into smaller segments, more easily digestible
Right. Right.
fragments. So for me, it was very helpful. So after really learning that on the screenwriting side, and yes, you're restricted in terms of video and audio on the screen, so that got to break some habits if you came in through prose, and you're not
hmm
allowed really to describe anything. You don't get the flowery
Oh.
language that you get in a book. It's in
Ah.
fact, Hollywood's notorious for if you have a dog in your story, it can't even be a Dalmatian or a Dachshund or a pug unless that's critical to the story,
Oh,
because
really?
somebody else is going to come in and decide what kind of dog should be there. So it's really limiting actually in that factor. one of the famous notes you'll get from screenwriting professors is this acronym SIFYN, which is Save It for Your Novel. So in that regard, yeah, it was a challenge. But so the story framework really helped me then go back to the book, because I'd had an earlier draft of the Crimson Sword, my first published book, and I was able to go back through and really kind of fix some of the pacing and some of the just the order in which things occurred, and gloss over some of the areas that either didn't have the right amount of conflict in overcoming the next obstacle, where it seemed more like, okay, we're just going here now, we're going here now. No, there got to be very specific obstacles that force you to go down a path you didn't expect to go down. So in that regard, there's a lot of similarities, and I think it really made my prose writing much stronger than it otherwise would have been. But yeah, on the screen side, you definitely got to break a few habits. And so for me, again, it's nice to have the two to bounce back and forth between.
Yeah.
The other major difference I'd have to say is that in books, most of us have hard time getting anybody, trusted readers, beta readers, as it were, that are insightful enough to tell you what's working and not working, but also not only insightful enough, but honest enough. If they're our friends, they don't want to hurt our feelings, or maybe some of them do. On the screenwriting side, everybody and their dog is going to tell you what it should be and how it should be. And so if you're in a mood to have a little more freedom and flexibility, that's when I definitely want to go write a book. If I want a little more help and interaction and collaborative environment, then that's what screenwriting is really good for, because you'll get all kinds of feedback that you don't even want, but if they're in the right position, you got to figure out how to take it into account. So
yeah. And now you adapted the Shannara, the Elfstones, yeah? Elfstones.
Yeah, and that came about while I was in school, because I was struggling with story structure, as I say. And so here I was trying to tell an original story, which I was still struggling to learn how to do in an unfamiliar structure. So I kind of stepped back, said, wait a minute, why don't I, instead of trying to learn both at the same time, why don't I take a story that I believe works very well, and my favorite book, had been, probably still is, Elfstones of Shannara. So I took that story just as an exercise and thought, I'm just going to adapt this book and just focus on learning the story structure in a feature-length film format.
Sure.
And by the time I was done with it, I was happy enough with it that I ended up meeting Terry at a writers conference he was teaching at in Hawaii, on Maui of all places, and showed him I'd done this thing, and of course he and all his agents were like, whoa, you don't get to touch this stuff. But he was really gracious and said, hey, as long as you're not trying to sell it or anything, then go ahead, use it for your exercise.
Yeah.
And by the time all was said and done, we ended up becoming friends, and he read it and he liked it. And so the next thing you know, we were actually actively shopping it and got that picked up. And
what a weird
yeah, no, it really is. And believe me, this is, for those who are dealing with obstacles in their lives, or people telling them they can't do something or another, this was definitely one of those roads where I must have had 24 different people say, you can't do that. But it was my passion, and I knew all the pitfalls. I knew the potential potholes, and thought, well, this might go really bad, and it could be a waste of my time, which is what most people were suggesting. But I thought, it's what I love, it's what I'm passionate about, and ultimately, I think we have better odds of following those things, even if it doesn't work out. Most of us, even when we're struggling writing or struggling doing something, we enjoy the struggle, if that's fair to be said.
You learned something in the struggle. There's definitely that. And if you learned something, then it was probably worthwhile. Yeah.
So that was, for me, that certainly proved to be the case. Now, like I say, ultimately the movie didn't get made, and then they ended up doing a TV show, which I was not involved with, for better or worse. And there's, of course, going to be all kinds of different opinions on whether or not the TV show was the right way to go, and whether or not how well it was executed. I know there's fans and detractors of that, like everything else.
I was mostly confused by the music in that one.
Yeah, I happened to notice that too. And when I watched the very first episode, I thought, wow, this nonstop music, which works or doesn't, depending on the reader or the viewer.
It's become common, I think, in at least television series to have the music all the time.
Yeah, it seems to be. Yeah, but that was the first time I'd really noticed it, and I
Yeah,
found it a little jarring.
yeah. But it's a completely different format. I mean, I don't get music when I read a book unless I'm actively listening to something while I'm reading, which is,
Yeah, there you go.
different.
Do you do that?
No, I don't have that capability. I can listen to music while I write, but it has to be something that I've heard 1,000 times, and I can just put it into the background. So Mozart.
Kind of white noise. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do the same. I tend to do the same. I use the music, certainly when I'm starting a writing session, it helps me to kind of tune out everything else. And I generally would play orchestral stuff.
Sure.
Movie soundtracks are really popular for me. The
Yeah,
Conan or Braveheart or Gladiator or some of those.
yeah. So as far as the writing process itself, from conception of idea to the impressions of the readers, do you have a least favorite bit?
A least favorite bit?
Mhm.
For me, I would say it's the blank piece. So the ideas tend to come to me. I think like most of us, it's generally not for me at least, it's not a eureka moment. It's not an
Mhm.
epiphany generally. It's usually a collection of
Yeah.
ideas. So I have to actively work at it in the sense of getting to know my characters. Forget plot for a second. Just who are my characters? What do they want? How do they
Mhm.
behave when they don't get what they want? And then you kind of get stuck there. I do, and then okay, well, let me think about the plot. Let me go look at the plot structure and what should happen here.
Sure.
And then I get stuck there, and I go, let's go look at the map. Let's go look at the geography and see what the
Oh,
geography might imply.
maps. Yay.
Um,
Favorite.
right. So it's for me, it's not a linear progression. It's very much a bouncing, kind of turning a gem over and looking at it from different viewpoints, different
Mhm.
facets, and eventually it all kind of works together. And along the way, there are various, that would be great. But then I got to go compare that against everything else I've kind of set up and decide, does it
Right.
still work? Or is it something that I would have to tear down some other ideas that I was building in order to make this one work? Is it that good? Or is it not going to stand up if it's going to tear down everything else?
Right.
And especially as I found as you get stuff into print, of course, you can't take that back. So sometimes, we paint ourselves into a corner where we're like, oh, well, this would be really great, but I can't because I just established in, the book.
Yeah, the
You know,
graveyard of ideas.
right. There's an ocean there, so okay, that doesn't work. Can't get the characters across there and where they're
Mm.
at, or maybe I got to get them a ship somehow, or an airship, or teleportation. But I didn't invent any of those things in the previous series, so I can't use any of those things. So I would say for me, it's in the outlining phase because I do
Yeah.
believe in saving myself a lot of trouble in the long term by really fighting through the outline and making sure I have things worked out in advance.
Sure.
And it's when everything is possible and yet nothing is there to build on. And so it's once I have that outline that I really like and that I think is sound, then I think my favorite part is just sitting down each day and writing that scene. And I
Hmm.
hear some writers, if they know where it's going, they're bored. If they already know who did the killing or whatnot, know all the twists and turns, that they're not excited to write those scenes.
Hmm.
But for me, I really like it's just following the blueprint, coloring within the lines, and because I know that in advance, I'm able to do what a lot of folks have to do in a second or third draft, where they're trying to plant misdirection and they're foreshadowing and
Always difficult to
yeah.
get
And so for
in
me,
front.
I really like if I know where I'm going, I can immediately start misdirecting the reader in an honest way, as opposed to
Hmm.
a surprise. You didn't see this coming. Well, no, I didn't because you didn't set up any clues that I should
Yeah.
have. So that's where I find the most fun is in the daily execution of knowing where I'm going and how to maybe layer in, you know,
Yeah.
theme and some of the other secondary layers that generally would come with second or third drafts.
Sure.
But it's that getting started part. It's grinding through all the possibilities in the beginning that I find maybe the most challenging.
Hmm. Now I imagine it's rather completely different for short stories.
Yeah, for me, short stories, again, you don't get much room. So you've really got to have a strong idea and a really, for someone like me that's much more comfortable, I grew up reading to sprawling epics, so that's what I tend to write most naturally. The short story, I didn't even try for years and years and years. It's something I had to end up doing at a writers' conference as an exercise. They forced us to go out and tour. This particular one, we actually went to Italy, and we had to go out each day and tour a site, and then go and be inspired. Come up with a story idea, and then go home and write it. And we had to do 3 of those over the course of a week.
Wow.
So it's forced me to really try to find. I don't get cast of thousands. I don't get 50 locations. It's really just a short moment in time, and you try to find those. For me, the trick is finding a decision, a dilemma that would be difficult to answer. So if the answer to the question is typically a well, yeah, no, duh, obvious. If the answer is obvious, then it's not compelling to us, I think. But if it's like, oh my gosh, what would I do in that situation? I don't know. I can see both ways. Those are the kinds of dilemmas. But yeah, short stories for me are a challenge, because it's just that moment. Everything's got to work in that moment in a very short time span. And so, like for the Kylak one, I ended up settling on his first kill. I was thinking, okay, if I'm going to introduce the character, how is it that he became okay with, because he seems like a nice guy overall, so why is it that he's so cavalier about killing? And so I wanted to go back to the first kill and how resistant he would have been to that idea in the beginning, and what is it that pushed him over the edge, and how did that happen? And and then there were some other ideas that really fueled that in terms of relationships with father and friends, and being back at the being trained as an assassin back before he knew that's what he was being trained to be. So it all kind of came together, I thought, and for me in a really strong sense. Now I don't know. I have some of his other moments in time that just haven't, I haven't felt the same passion or strength about. So yeah, so that's why I haven't written those yet, even though it seems like it's a 15,000 words instead of 150, so it should be easier, right? But
it should be. No. I mean, answering those dilemmas in such a short amount of time in a compelling way is almost harder than writing a full-length novel.
For me, certainly, and I always think back to poetry. I've never written poetry. I've never attempted to write poetry, but I'm amazed by good poetry or song lyrics. Essentially, because the people that can convey in a few short words. I tend to be more of the guy like, if I don't get it right in the first sentence, I'll write another one. Try to write it another one. And then having to go back later and cut out all the ones that said the same thing in different ways, try to find the strongest ones. But people who can sit down and convey, emotion and passion and all of that in just a few short lines, to me is amazing.
It's very impressive. And something I have not yet mastered. C'est tragique. Oh well. So for writery types trying to get into, I'd say, the world of epic fantasy, traps that they should avoid.
Well, the biggest traps, I think, and it's it's a catch-22, of course. When I was getting started, my trap was that I was trying so hard to be original. That even though I had written these coming-of-age epic fantasy stories, I thought, no one's going to want to see that again. So I'm going to try to invent a world within a world, and I was trying to be so convoluted and so complex to be original that when I started taking this work to the writers' conference, particularly with Terry Brooks, he was the one who told me, he's like, you're trying too hard. Like, even if a person were capable of coming up with something truly original, by definition, how would any reader relate to that? How would anybody understand that? So he really kind of beat it into me that you have to accept that there's nothing new under the sun, and you have to trust in your voice to give it its unique flavor. And then when I was pursuing The Agent, he kind of said the same thing. His advice was, epic fantasy, like anything else, you've got to be the same but different. Right. Well, that seems to be how do I be the same and different? So it's just finding where, and actually someone else who preaches this a lot would be James Cameron, the filmmaker for Avatar and Titanic and all that, and people criticize, critics of the first Avatar movie would say that, oh, it's just Pocahontas in space. It's just Fern Gully. It's nothing new. And his argument was that I wanted to, if you too much spice ruins the dish. So if you give people too many unfamiliar elements, they have nowhere to kind of set their anchor and build off of, set the foundation. So he wanted things that were common enough and relatable enough, and people had seen them enough that they can latch onto that easily and see what he's doing, so that he could then focus on the one or two unique ideas, such as in his case, he talked about the fact that people were living in this alien body. So yes, everything else around it was very similar. The other challenge, of course, is that in epic fantasy, we have to explain everything. You can't just say they arrived at LAX or LaGuardia and the reader knows what that means or has an idea of what that means. You've got to explain your spaceports. You've got to explain your cities and villages. So too much of that, again, we have to do some of that, but sometimes we have to rely on things, on tropes and on things so that people have a relatable place to start. And then you can subvert them with one or two ideas along the way, and they'll go with you because everything else seems familiar.
Right.
So I think that's the biggest challenge for writers is in this space, is understanding, you can't be too much the same. People will toss your book aside or criticize it, and you can't be too different or people will toss your book aside and criticize it. So it's finding that balance of what you're okay with being been there, done that, and then what you want to focus on as your unique idea, so that people will take that leap of faith and suspend their disbelief because you seem to know what you're doing with the rest of it.
Right. Although finding which tropes to subvert can also be difficult.
Exactly.
Always fun.
And of course, we all get the full range. So I'm, of course, speaking in general terms, because some people that'll really like that twist you did or that trope you broke. Other people will be, I had some cannibalistic elves in my first book, and their feature in subsequent books. And some people I see that, what, elves, cannibals? Nope, I'm not going with them on that. Elves are supposed to be the purest, the most unquestioned. You've done that too?
With fairies, but
okay.
Yeah, something similar.
Yeah, and I don't think I've done anything, original. Even most of us, when we think we've done something original, it's only because we haven't read it yet. We haven't seen it in someone else's thing. And I never know how to feel, and I'm sure this is something else every writer deals with. When you think you've come up with something fresh, and then later on you read it like, oh, George Martin is doing that in Game of Thrones, or you're like, dang it, now everyone's gonna think I copied it. But hey, I was published first, so.
Oops.
So yeah, no original ideas. It's just in how we execute them. And the other, I think, lesson I might share real quick, that the other thing that helped me with that concept was on that Italy trip, that writer excursion. One of the days we had to, when we were looking for ideas, we had to do it with a partner. So we all got paired up, and we all had to work from we had to agree on what the idea was, just the 25-word, what if statement. But then we had to go write our own separate stories. And so even we saw over and over again with that exercise, even with the exact same idea, the same kernel of a writer's prompt, if you will.
Sure.
When we came back and read those stories afterward, they were vastly different. One person's might be a horror, and the other person took that same idea and made it a beautiful travelogue.
Wow.
So it really was. It showed me that you can take the same concept, and by the time you're done executing it, if you're doing that individually, it will be. That's where we bring in our own experiences and interests and whatnot, and make it our own.
Yeah. Ooh. Oh, I'm trying to think how you get from a travelogue to a horror.
Well,
I mean, that's very impressive.
Yeah, I thought so. I remember one of my partners that I was actually in that group where she came back with a travelogue, and it was just beautiful. It was just eloquent, and made me want to go visit Italy just to see Italy. And I'm like, but mine's really quite different and dark, and actually my instructor at the time was John Saul, who I don't think he's doing too much writing these days. I think he's retired, but he was a big name for a long time with a lot of supernatural stories along the lines of a Dean Koontz or a Stephen King, and he was intrigued by the horror one, and it was, again, well, to each their own. I like the travelogue version now that I hear it. So
yeah. Ooh, what fun! Well, it has been super awesome talking with you. I'm very interested to read your work because cannibalistic elves. Yeah, ooh. Okay. I might be a little bit darker than otherwise today. We'll see about that. So, is there anything else you'd like to add? Writing related, not writing related, something about unicycles? I don't know.
Unicycles, you got me intrigued.
Yeah,
No, just obviously wish everyone the best. And this it's an uncertain time right now. It's it's one thing when we have dark moments, and we know they're going to pass. Because we know there's something on the other side. But I can see now why viruses and end of the world viral type stories are so popular because this isn't. There's hundreds of thousands of them out there waiting for us. So this is one where we this could change our lives for quite some time because the way we conduct ourselves and whatnot. And I hate to think we can no longer interact as a species entirely.
That'll change. It's a temporary lack of interaction. However, after the fact, I think the interactions will have changed fundamentally simply because, depending on how long this goes on, how do we go back to quote unquote normal?
Yeah. I think there'll be a new normal, but this isn't just okay. We got to rebuild something. Meteor struck us, so lots of devastation. But hey, we can rebuild.
Sure.
This is an ongoing challenge, so we're gonna have to figure out something, I guess, as to how we deal with these things and how we maybe prevent them. I don't know.
We shall see.
But good luck to everybody, and I really appreciate you speaking with me this morning. It was a great pleasure.
Great fun. It's always good to be able to talk to someone, perhaps not face to face, but still, even so.
Yeah, I don't talk to enough writer types these days, so it's always fun for me to talk to folks who understand that particular breed of madness we all share.
That's a good way to put it. I like that.